Well, I want to welcome you here. Thank you so much for joining us for this evening's workshop called Teaching with New Light. I could not be more excited to be sharing this screen with so many wonderful people who you're going to meet very shortly. I am Emily Scheinberg. I'm the head of educator and professional development at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. We are going to be going into virtually through slides and through discussion this exhibition, Teaching with New Light. And we are just really excited to be together to use this exhibition as a resource for discussion, as a resource for thinking about how art can be engaged with in the classroom in so many new ways. I am going to now turn it over to our next slide, actually, Sophia. I wanted to acknowledge that the Museum of Fine Arts Boston is in Boston, Massachusetts. Founded in 1870, the MFA stands on a site which has long served as a place of meeting and exchange among different Algonquin nations, including the Massachusetts. As a museum, we acknowledge the long histories of the land we occupy today and seek ways to make Indigenous narratives more prominent in our galleries and programming. And this is a land acknowledgement that is being actively discussed and reevaluated to be a more actionable statement that reflects our current commitments and collaborations. And it's certainly the case that this is a very central belief for everything that we do in our teacher programs and partnerships that we have to really think about how we can center Indigenous narratives and be engaging in partnerships. Next slide. And I also am actually going to take a moment to put a link in the chat to the Massachusetts tribe so that you can learn more. I meant to say that a moment ago. I want to note that this workshop is being recorded and we may be uploading it to YouTube in the coming months into the MFA's website. Thank you. So just a little bit of information about today's program. There is a transcript and there are closed captions available through Rev and Zoom Live Captions. To enable those closed captions, just like these instructions say, you go to the bottom of the Zoom window, you click that little up arrow next to closed captions, and then click that show subtitle to start displaying Rev Live Captions. Please use the chat function to ask questions and share comments. This is going to be very much a conversation. You'll see it'll be a conversation among the panelists, and we hope it'll be a conversation with you as well. Next slide. And now I have the pleasure of giving a very brief overview. We're going to be hearing first from my colleague, Michelle Miller-Fisher, who is the Ronald C. and Anita L. Warnick Curator of Contemporary Decorative Arts at the MFA. And Michelle is an educator. She is a curator first, but I would say also is an educator. You can learn a lot about Michelle's work that she does, the many exhibitions and different projects and teaching on her website that's now in the chat as well. And she's just really an exceptional colleague in thinking about how art is interacting with the public, interacting with community, and interacting with educators in particular. So I'm delighted to turn it over to Michelle in just a moment, and then we will be hearing from Allison Cronin-Moses and members of the MFA's STEAM team and Teen Arts Council. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Emily. It's wonderful to be here. Hello to everybody who's gathered, and hello in the future to anybody who's using this as a teaching resource. If you could go to the next couple of slides, if that's okay. Thank you so much, Sophia. So this is perfect. I'm really pleased to be here, and I'm going to give a very short overview, 3 to 5 minutes. I'll keep it as succinct as I can, to an exhibition that opened here at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston in early July of 2021, and will run for just over a year. So it's up as a teaching resource and hopefully for visitors to come and enjoy for quite a long period of time. And it draws upon the museum's collection. So it's objects that will be with us for forever, and hopefully you'll get to see them in new configurations outside of this exhibition exhibition too. And I'm here talking about this exhibition on behalf of a really large team. As I'm going to explain momentarily, I'm a curator and I make exhibitions, and at the museum, everybody helps make the exhibitions how they end up being. But this one was kind of an interesting process in terms of the exhibition coming to formation itself. So you're looking at here a slide of the galleries that it occupies at the museum, Foster and Robb. So it's in the first floor of the museum, and just as you come through the education entrance, if you're familiar with the museum's floor plan. Next slide, please, Sophia. So this exhibition came about early on during the pandemic. Like many of you, perhaps, you might have been at home away from your workplace. Many of the museum staff were as well, although not everybody. There are a few really fantastic and wonderful colleagues who were in the museum keeping things running. But for many of us, we were then working from home and working away from the objects that we had interacted with, taught from, looked after, cared for every single day. This exhibition was born from that very particular circumstance, creating an exhibition in very strange and unusual circumstances, and doing so in ways that had to take into account that we couldn't get to some of the objects that we wanted to as easily as we could. So the premise for the exhibition was we, in the contemporary department where I work, like every curatorial department, welcome new objects into the museum's collection by acquiring them. They're acquisitions and they come in a very regular basis, and they help grow the collection. And it was our contention, and it always has been, I think, for every curator, that every new object that one brings into the museum's collection changes the stories that you can tell with objects in exhibitions. It's a little bit like a sort of a ping pong effect or a knock-on effect, a ripple effect. When you add a story, when you add some artist's work, living or historical, to the museum's collection, it expands and makes different the stories that are possible to tell through exhibiting that collection. So logistically, because we were all spread out at home, we thought, well, what would it look like if we created a list of the acquisitions that the contemporary department, so the folks who are working with living artists at the museum, what would it look like if we created a list of all of the acquisitions by living artists that have come into the museum over the last 2 years? And we shared that with our curatorial colleagues across the museum. And we asked them about their collections. And we told them a little bit about these works by living artists and asked them what in their collections might resonate with those living artists' works. And they came back to us and said, yes, that would be really interesting as a premise for an exhibition. And so we had a big meeting in, I think it was July or August of 2020, with most of the curators from across the museum, everyone who could attend, and also really importantly, conservators, educators, interpretation folks, design, exhibition design as well. We shared the works that were new to our collections. And our conservation and exhibitions department said, well, because none of us are on site right now, and because we have less resources than we might usually have, we would like to create an exhibition that brings old and new works together. And we need these old works to be things that are easy to get out of storage, but maybe haven't ever been shown before, to make sure that new audiences and old audiences coming to the museum get to see some very special conversations, get to see things that they might not usually see coming out of storage. And so next slide, please, Sophia. You get to see some of the objects like this slide, Jean-Claude Smith, Dana Chandler and Tomashi Jackson's works that have come in over the last 2 years. And they come from across the museums. We have, objects coming from across the museum's other collections to be in conversation with them. So when you walk into the galleries of New Light, it's almost as if you're coming across a dinner party conversation of 21 different pairings that have a new work, a new acquisition from a contemporary living artist, and then one, sometimes 2 or 3 works from artists and collections that are across the curatorial departments. And so if you go to the next slide, please, Sophia. You see two works just here, one by the living artist Lakayla Brown, who is Detroit based, and then an ancient Egyptian fragment, which depicts, likely we think, a princess from the 18th dynasty, from the daughter of the pharaoh Akhenaten and Queen Nefertiti. It would have originally been part of a brightly colored wall composition, but here it takes on a life of its own as a fragment. It comes from the ancient Egyptian collection at the museum, and this was a suggestion of our ancient Egyptian curator, Larry Berman. When we opened up this exhibition and conversation between all of the curatorial departments at the museum, we said, can you take a look at what we have shown you as these new works from our new acquisitions? And can you think about works that you'd like to bring into conversation with them? So this was Larry's proposal. He was really taken with the way in which Lakayla's interest in ancient Egyptian subject matter, and he wanted to bring into conversation with that particular work something from his own collection as well. And so he looked at the way in which Lakayla looks at the similar surface textures, the sparse composition, the expression of pride and beauty and kinship, the notion of a relief and her approach to that. Here, Lakayla Brown is incorporating reliefs taken directly from the body, so very wearable accessories. There's very specific references to Black pop culture, African histories. These are impressions that you can see here of triangular door knocker earrings, so very emblematic of early hip hop culture. And there's also low relief images and more concave impressions of contemporary popular jewelry. So she's very interested in ancient Egyptian culture and pride in that culture as a US-based artist. And so this is just one of the pairings that New Light rests upon in terms of bringing together the work of living artists and the work from artists and makers across the rest of the museum's curatorial departments. Next slide, please, Sophia. And so one other pairing that I will share with you, and I share this one in particular because we have a lot of resources to help stimulate conversations in the classroom, if this is one that you would like to direct students to, or if it's something that chimes with your particular curriculum. We can certainly share the labels from across the exhibition, and each one of the labels has an artist's own words. So every living artist in the exhibition is represented by commentary that talks about their own work, why they made it, and sometimes even the reason that they're excited to have their work in this particular exhibition. But here you're looking at the work of two artists, Dana Chandler, Boston-based artist, on the left-hand side, and Benny Andrews, a New York-based artist, on the right-hand side. Both of these artists were particularly interested in talking about issues of race and racism in the US, talking about brutality, police brutality and otherwise. And we have their work in the exhibition as another one of these conversational pairings. Benny Andrews, a war veteran, was particularly interested in the experiences of Black men in the military and the very different treatment that they had in comparison to their white counterparts. And he talked about a war on Black lives that was happening outside of US borders. Dana Chandler, a Boston-based artist and activist, talked about the war that was happening in the US, specifically, again, referencing racism. Many of you might know his work if you are Boston-based. Here, very quickly, he's looking at the murder of the Black Panther Party leader, Fred Hampton, which occurred in 1969 in Chicago. And he's responding to that with this particular work that you see on the left-hand side, a large sculptural piece that references the bullet holes that the police made through Fred Hampton's door when they came to his house. If you go to the next slide, Sophia, you can see that this was actually the second work that he created. The first work was shown at the World's Fair. It was a painting, and it was actually stolen from the World's Fair. So he made a second larger piece that was much more monumental and much more difficult to steal. He, at the same point in time, was very active calling upon museums to show the work of Black artists and to think more carefully about structural racism. And so we've developed an exhibition that is a companion piece to New Light. It's called Black Power in Print. And if you go to the next slide, we can also put this link in our chat. Black Power in Print looks at a document that Dana Chandler sent actually to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston to Perry Rathbone, who was then the director in 1970. It's an incredibly exciting incendiary manifesto that in many ways feels like it could have been written yesterday. And in it, Dana Chandler, he calls it a proposal to eradicate institutional racism at the Boston MFA. And he speaks specifically to the lack of representation of Black artists in the exhibition and in the gallery walls, but also sets out very clearly a mandate for how the museum could hire and cultivate Black curators and Black arts administrators. We have digitized and made fully accessible the manifesto and the correspondence that Rathbone brought to bear on this particular situation. If you go to the next slide, Sophia, you can see the title of it. Thank you. And then the next slide as well, which shows some of the facts and figures. He sort of left sorry, actually, I didn't put that one in. You can, if you go to the manifesto, you can see the facts and figures that Dana Chandler, as an artist, but also as an activist, laid out as a foundation, a platform really for thinking about a more equitable museum. So those are resources that complement the work that is in New Light and expand it into conversations that I think are both timely and super interesting. We have a companion public program actually that my colleague Liz Mansell conducted with Dana Chandler a couple of weeks ago. He's 80 and he's still incredibly cogent about these issues and ideas that he explored 50 years ago. So the exhibition, I'll finish with the last slide before I introduce Alison. The exhibition thinks about many different artists' works from many different perspectives, both historical and living. And it's a way to bring into bear or into focus, we hope, as people come into the exhibition, as people engage with it, the notion of being in conversation, both with these artists across eras and across time periods, but being in conversation with some of these issues and ideas which remain in a cyclical way, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse, incredibly timely. So I know Alison is now going to introduce some specific ways in which teachers, students, and curriculums might meet this particular exhibition. It's my delight to introduce Alison. She's a phenomenal artist. We're lucky to have 2 works of hers now in the Museum of Fine Arts collection. I've known her and her work for a couple of years now since moving to Boston. Aside from being an artist and a craftsperson, she's also an educator, an art administrator, and a mother. She's spoken very, very brilliantly and movingly about her work across many different intersections. She is an accomplished educator. She works and does beautiful things at the Elliott School of Fine and Applied Arts. And we're so lucky to have her here at the MFA. So thank you, Alison, for coming to share your wisdom with us. And I'm really excited to meet all of the folks that you've gathered for tonight's conversation. I hand the floor over to you, but I'm on hand if I can help.
Thank you, Michelle. That's awesome. So I am like sitting here in awe of the curatorial knowledge that you bring, because part of this conversation is recognizing that we don't all hold those details. So I just, I'm sitting here, and the way that you talk about the work really does bring it to life, but it's with an immense amount of knowledge. So thank you for that context for the exhibit, but also my introduction.
Thank you, Alison. And I will say, just before I leave, one of the delights about this exhibition, because it happened across so many departments, is that I actually am not the expert on a lot of the works that are in there. And that feels really good, because it makes me understand often how others may feel as they come into the museum. I can enjoy these works, but I don't know as much as Larry does about ancient Egyptian works, for example. So
yeah,
it's been a great learning curve that way.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. How does it sound? How's it sound to everybody? Good? Okay, good, great. So I will just do a little context of how we got to this space, and then we'll introduce some other folks. So I was really excited to be invited into this conversation, one, because my work is in the New Light exhibit, which I never thought my work would be in museums. And then I also just really struggle with my experience with art history in particular. And I love this idea of pairing new works with older works. But to me, what's so interesting about this exhibit is the fact that we actually can engage in conversations that really relate to what's happening now, along with what's happened in the past. And I thought a really great way to do that is to talk to some young folks that are integrated into the MFA, that are part of that, the Teen Arts Council and the STEAM group, and bring them in to have a conversation about, well, what does this exhibit mean to you all, and how do we spark those conversations and kind of put it in a different context. So with that in mind, that's just a quick kind of how I was thinking about this workshop. I want to turn it over to Sydney to introduce the teens and the program, and then we'll start a conversation.
And actually, I think we're going to let Elsa jump in
Yeah.
and start introducing. Little quick change.
No, sorry, that was my
that was me.
There you go.
Totally fine. Hi, I'm Elsa, and I am part of the Teen Arts Council. So the Teen Arts Council is a youth program here at the MFA that works a lot with empowering the youth to talk about and learn more about art. And we do a lot of that by going into the exhibits at the MFA, even working with the exhibits at the MFA, and having conversations like these with the curators that work here. We'll be going down the row and people will introduce themselves from TAC.
Hi, my name is Sadie. I'm a senior at Boston Latin Academy, and I'm on the Teen Arts Council as well.
Hi, my name is Marta, Marta Mejia, and my program is TAC. I go to Fenway High School, and I'm a senior.
Hi, my name is Raheem. I'm a junior at the John D. O'Brien School, and I'm a part of TAC.
Hi, my name is Karen. I'm a senior at Madison Park, and I'm also in the group TAC.
Hi, my name is Heather. I'm a junior at Cathedral High School, and I am part of STEAM team.
My name is Ariana. I go to Fenway High School. I'm in the 10th grade, and I'm part of STEAM team.
STEAM team is basically a program where teens like us, we get the opportunity to see the behind the scenes of the behind the scenes of how art is put in the exhibition. For example, we get to work with conservators, curators, and we get to do things like sculpture maintenance and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, anything you want to add?
Not right now.
All right, thank you. That's all. Bye.
Awesome. Thank you all for introducing yourselves and participating tonight, because I know this is different than what you normally are doing during your time together. So I'm going to share my screen and let's see if we can do this. All right, cool. So just to give a little bit more context, the goal for tonight is really to have conversations with, for me to have conversations with the young folks and us to talk about the exhibit, but also to engage everyone who's in the Zoom room tonight. So through chats, we'll put questions in the chat to get us thinking about the exhibit and the works, and how do we engage our students in different ways than we have possibly in the past. And then, during the last kind of 20 minutes, maybe, hopefully, we're going to invite the audience members to actually engage in a conversation about some of the artworks that we'll display on the screen. And so the conversation to me, when Michelle talked about this exhibit, and I learned about it and from talking to other folks, it was really intriguing to me, because I was one of those students who tried to study really hard, but couldn't remember the names and dates and any of that background information. I remember waking up at Rhode Island School of Design in the furniture department lecture hall and falling asleep, like not meaning to, but falling asleep across the seats in the lecture, and staying up night after night studying, and always thinking I did better and then actually doing worse, no matter what I tried, like that to this day. But what I do remember now is the feelings that I get from seeing certain pieces of art, the conversation about the art. And then when I have these experiences where it feels like it is living to me. And that's kind of the intention of why I wanted to engage in a conversation instead of doing a traditional workshop. So, like Michelle said, I work at the Elliott School of Fine and Applied Arts. We do a lot of professional development for teachers I'm also an artist, right? So my work is in the exhibit. And so this is a little bit of a different kind of approach for me, because I feel like this exhibit really is different. And so I just want to bring in, in the prep for this conversation today, we visited the MFA and I got to meet all the young folks in person, and we, had an initial conversation. And so some of that will kind of be woven in tonight, as well as new ideas that come to us. So, to start, I want to, this image that we're seeing is the wall when you walk in. And then this is, another shot from a different view of the entire space. And I want to bring in Rahim, Elsa, and Sadie, and just, we talked in person. We walked through the space together and we thought about how this was a little bit of a different experience. And I just wanted to ask you all to chime in and share what makes this a different experience to begin with. Elsa, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can definitely start off. Michelle kind of pointed out this already, but the thing about this exhibit is that everything is paired. So there isn't just one spotlight to it. Everything has its own spotlight in a certain way, and it's having this conversation throughout the whole exhibit, but the conversations are all different.
I think something that one of our coworkers mentioned is that the walls are this sort of color that's slightly different than a lot of other exhibits. You can sort of see the hallway outside is the same color, but it does give this distinct feeling of like we are in this space where everything is separated from the rest of the museum. And that color sort of shows like a differentiation between this exhibit and the rest of the museum.
Yeah, and that, just to think about that a little bit, so they're really gray walls. And I think about that when I think of a gallery. We walk into a gallery space, and it's often white walls with the highlighted lights, and it feels a little sterile. So when you said that, Sadie, it kind of stepped back. I didn't realize that it was curated to the color of the walls. So thanks for sharing that. It's really interesting to me. Rahim, do you have anything to share about that?
Yeah, I would like to share, I like to add on to the fact that Elsa said everything's in pairs. Also, the space is very open. So you have a lot of space to maneuver and actually look at stuff. It's not very close up. You can actually stand far back and take stuff in. So it's very welcoming for everybody, I should say.
I would agree with the welcoming point, and say that it's also super accessible because of these pairs. How even if people have not done a lot of thinking personally about how to engage with art, if they're not experienced in engaging with art, these pairs create an access point of saying, oh, this is a pairing. I wonder why it's paired together. Why are we thinking about these two pieces in conversation? And it can provide that sort of jumping off point for people who maybe have never thought about the way that art has conversations with each other before.
Yeah, to even add on to that, it's having different types of art as well. Maybe you're a person that looks more at oil on canvas. Now you're looking at sculptures. Now you're looking at fabric. You're not just looking at what you initially are interested in. You're getting these new interests because there are these new pairings.
Yeah, and when we saw each other in person and had this conversation, it was right after I participated. There's a craft think tank held by the Center for Craft in North Carolina. It was over Zoom this year, and I was able to attend. And there was a moment, the dialogue was around what craft can, what can craft do? It was really interesting. There's a lot of folks in the room discussing this, thinking this, and sharing their own experience. And at one moment, I think about racial equity a lot in the work that I do as an artist and as an art administrator. And this, I kind of wrestle with this idea of decolonization of what does that mean? Can we really work to be at a time before colonization? How does that happen? What does that even look like in the current world that we live? But in thinking about craft, I often have feelings of my thoughts which sounds wild when I say it out loud, but I often have feelings. And I was sitting there in this meeting, and I felt like, I felt what it could be, what it could mean to really decolonize craft and art. Like I had this like sense of it that was different than I had been thinking about art in the past. And when we were talking at the MFA probably a month ago now, standing in this room, those thoughts came back to me because I thought about, wow, the curators have selected pieces to be in conversation. They're on like kind of an equal platform, right? They're like in conversation equally with each other and with the pieces around. There's no hierarchy. And I can't remember who said it, but someone said it, I think it's Elsa, it doesn't highlight one piece. One piece isn't the focus. Everything has a parent and a purpose. And you said that in our conversation then, and I thought, wow, that in essence was kind of that feeling that I had of like, no one person, no one culture, no one anything is above the other, but it is an equal conversation. And how do we get there? How do we create that as a feeling, especially in our culture that's hierarchical and is always like, we're always trying to win. Like I have a 5-year-old who's always trying to win. But how do we actually get to this place of wanting to be in this kind of equal community? So anyway, I know I just like kind of dove into that a little bit, but I thought that was really interesting. And we have in the chat, we're putting questions in the chat. So I do encourage folks that are in the Zoom audience to answer, respond to them, comment back, ask other questions as well. And I'm also struck by how large this space is. And if any of the folks, Elsa, Raheem, anybody, Sadie wants to talk about like walking through, what is that experience like? Because it's kind of a large space.
I would say that when you first walk in, I think that it's interesting that there is this sort of immediate decal of this, new light. It tells you exactly what you're walking into. And I think that was a very smart choice because the rest of the exhibit is sort of spaced out. There's not a lot of, and I think that this was something that Elsa was sort of talking about, how there's not a description of each piece. Like there's labels and stuff, but there's not descriptions of why things are necessarily paired together. And there's not like a clear path that you're supposed to walk because it goes off in both directions. So walking through it sort of begins, you see like, this is what it is, this is how it begins, and you can choose your own path, which I think is in the spirit of the exhibit.
Yeah, adding on the whole idea of choosing your own path is really great because when you think about it, this space is so open. A lot of the time with exhibits, you're making it so that people are walking in a certain direction. You're making it so that they're looking at certain pieces at a certain time. But with this, you are almost curating your own tour. You're creating your own experience with this.
That's cool. Michelle, was that intentional?
Yeah, it absolutely was meant to be that you could bounce from place to place. So often when an exhibition is created, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. There's a very intentional pathway. Mm-hmm. It's quite didactic. I don't want to say it's sort of an imposition, but there's a curatorial voice, there's an authority there, and somebody says, this is how you'll take in this information. And I think finally people have realized that that's not how museum going happens a lot of the time. You might come in and, the smaller person or the older person that you're with talks to you for the first 5 minutes. So by the time you've gotten through part of the exhibition, you've missed the beginning, but you start in the middle. Or your attention might lapse, or something else might catch your attention across the room. And so you move in a way that you didn't expect to, or the exhibition designer didn't expect to. And so here, yeah, we're really thinking about the ways in which you can come in and choose your own path.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I keep thinking as an educator, we really have to teach to the folks that are the least likely to engage. And I know that's maybe controversial for some classrooms, but I think in the museum setting, it's absolutely true. I was at a museum, I was at the Science Museum, I think last weekend, And I realized, oh, I have only been to museums like this, and even at the MFA as an adult or on field trips. And it took me years to learn a different way of walking through, because I would walk through and just like glaze over so much of it. And it, it's just that recognition that if we're teaching to the folks that are not likely to stop at every single piece, that haven't been in those spaces or rarely have, how do we do that? How do we teach to those folks and make it really interesting and hopefully engaging for all in that way? So thanks for chiming in on that. Any questions in the chat? I like the So Sophie asks, was the decision to make 2 entrances to the exhibit intentional? Sounds like it. Right, Michelle? And it's not even at the 2, it's like 2, not beginning and end. It's like kind of in a midpoint.
Yeah, it's a funny space to design in. And I was saying earlier, it takes a village to create any kind of exhibition. One of my favorite types of colleague at the museum, and we have amazing folks of this expertise type, are exhibition designers and graphic designers. And so they really help us find our way through exhibitions and kind of frame exhibitions so that people can find their way in and enjoy the space while they're in there. And so this is a hot space to plan for and design for, because it's 2 galleries that sometimes could have separate things in them if we wanted them to, but sometimes can be joined together in one big exhibition. And so it's not like it's a gallery that is really, or a set of galleries that are really predisposed to having what somebody very smartly called a choose your own adventure kind of exhibition, rather than a you must start here and end here kind of exhibition. So we repeat the introductory intro title and the intro text at 2 places where people are most likely to join the exhibition. But we were hoping, and when I say we, it really was Kyla Hajishan, who's our amazing exhibition designer, and Evan Haynes, who's both an artist in the exhibition and also one of the museum's amazing graphic designers, who tried to think of how people could sort of find themselves or acquaint themselves with the space depending on where they entered it first of all.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm going to go on to the next pairing, or the first pairing. See if I can do this. So these 2 pieces are, I'm pulling up my notes to make sure I say it correctly. So on the left, we have Virgin and Child Enthroned with Cardinal Alonso Borja, I want to say. Michelle, you can feel free to correct me if you need to. And this, sorry, give me a second here. So this was by Gonçalves Paris, maybe. So go ahead.
I was just saying absolutely beautiful, fantastic.
Yes, so that's on the left, thank you. So that's on the left, and then Levon Jenkins' I Want to Learn You is on the right. And I just think it's really interesting, these pairings, and let me actually look at my notes to make sure I'm not going off of what I'm actually supposed to be asking. So Elsa, you said something when you toured the New Light exhibit that seemed so obvious, but I hadn't put words to it. And you were saying that, and I think you just mentioned it as well, the exhibit doesn't tell you what artworks are paired. You have to draw those connections. They're positioned closely. They don't tell you why. There's a written description from the artist, but also kind of a overall about the art. And so it allows you many entry points into the work for you to figure that out yourself. And so I just wanted to think about these pieces, and from your own perspective, how do you see these 2 as being paired in conversation? What are the connections or the differences?
So Raheem and Sadie actually did this one, but
Okay.
I mean, just personally, I think that I look at it at more of a feminine lens. Like, it's a man bowing down to a woman, and something about that is a little empowering. But again, it's always to someone's perspective. That's how I see it. I know Raheem and Sadie saw it a little differently.
Yeah, I saw it in a similar way. I was thinking about that when I first saw it, and I think the obviously the one on the left is explicitly religious painting, and on the one on the right is obviously alluding to those two similar scenes like this. The with just being supplicant to a standing figure is sort of um, is a clear allusion to that religious posture. But I also was thinking about, and I think that this slide compared to the last one really shows this, was the importance of the scale of these pieces. And I think that this is something that comes into question when teaching about art online through pictures, because so much of it is based on it being, the dimensions of the pieces. And I was thinking about it as how they're sort of a similar scene, but completely different sizes. And the piece on the left just like is meant for more public consumption and planning to tell a story that most people can be part of. And I think that the piece on the right, I Want to Learn You, especially with that title, forces you to get in close and like pay attention to the details of the piece and forces you to be part of that intimate moment that's happening on the right. And also with scale would be the scale of the figures and how the person kneeling on the left is much smaller than the woman standing, and versus on the right, they hold sort of an equal power. And I think that these kind of dimensional problems, or these sort of dimensions, are problems that arise when we look at pictures like this, which is zoomed in. You might not know. You might think the one on the right is life-sized. You might think the one on the left is for a locket. And it just sort of like the dimensions are really important to see in person. I think that's such an interesting aspect of this exhibit.
Raheem, do you have anything to add? Or anyone really?
So this piece, they both have like similar backstories, but at the same time, they're like completely different. And also the piece on the right, it has like a lack of detail, but it's like you can clearly tell the story it's trying to portray. And so also is on the right, they have like similar position. I mean, like positioning and placements. So
Yeah, I'm gonna read something from the wall text. It struck me when I was reading it. So Levon Jenkins says, I mean, you can interpret the painting however you want. And I think that is an interesting conversation about the power dynamics that you all were mentioning. But Levon Jenkins says, I'm always thinking two-dimensionally, but you could imagine pulling it, but if you could imagine pulling that piece off the canvas and have it exist in the real world around us, that's what I try to do. It's like when you look at those Sargent paintings in the MFA, I love those paintings. When I was in school, I walked through the museum and I always imagined myself walking into that painting and around those figures. I want to be part of it. I couldn't find other paintings doing it, or at least the way that I was envisioning it. So he is painting three-dimensionally, painting a two-dimensional painting three-dimensionally. And I think that's so interesting. Like to me, I don't want to walk into the painting on the left. But seeing a photo of the painting on the right, I feel the energy differently. And so I think that's, I don't know, to hear the artist himself like describe like how he came to making paintings that way is really, really interesting to me. Any other thoughts about how these two are the same or different?
I had a thought about the quote you just read, and I think that that's sort of in the way that feeds into the conversation about how the I Want to Learn You is all about painting. It's about being inside of a painting, but it actually is like a three-dimensional sculpture. I don't know if it comes across in the image, but it is three-dimensional. It's not just a painting, which sort of takes it away from the thought of like, we're thinking about it as like, oh, we're inside this painting, but it's not necessarily a painting anymore. Being inside it becomes an experience, and it becomes the like experience of painting. And being inside that experience of painting is such a different experience than looking at the painting on the left and seeing like, oh, this is a two-dimensional depiction of a scene, versus I'm sort of in inside this art form. I'm inside this like medium that I know that exists as its own art form, not necessarily related to the scene that it's depicting. And I think that just that difference in medium, even though it might initially seem like they're similar in medium, they're both paint. I think that difference really adds to the conversation between them.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think we had a question in the chat from Gary.
How do you think the lighting affects the atmosphere, especially with the black walls? Karen, do you have any thoughts on that?
It's kind of hard to say. I think it all depends on how you see it for yourself. For me, in comparison to like the regular white walls that are surrounding like certain parts of the museum, some paintings, some artworks are more popped out because it depends on like what surrounds them. But when it comes to this part of the museum, like for New Light, I think it makes everything like there, like it's like not, you can't miss it. I mean, there's certain parts of that exhibit like you can't, there's a wall probably blocking it. But even when you turn back around, you're like, oh, that's there. So it's like more popped out. A lot of the artworks are more colorful than the rest. And it's like, you notice like for this example, like Virgin and the Child, like the color schemes are more popped out and it helps with the lighting as well. So you can see every detail. So I think the black walls make everything pop out more than what you usually see for the other rest of the museum.
Yeah, go ahead. I sorry to interrupt you. Oops. So one of the things I was thinking about is in the classrooms, like I wonder how do we give artworks that same type of attention when, you know, our walls are cluttered with other imagery that we have to be teaching to. And, you know, college level is different, but oftentimes those are white walls. And so how do you kind of mimic that kind of, it's not quite like reverence, but it's allowing space in a different way for the art to be seen. Because I do think we look at it differently. It feels like, I think someone said, it feels like you're in kind of like your living room or in like a calmer, more comfortable space, and you're able to be a little bit more intimate with the work. So I just like wonder that. And if in y'all's classrooms, are they like, do you have space when artwork is shown? Is it on a slide? Is there actual pieces of art? Like, do you all display your own artwork? And like, how do you think the adjustment of the lighting and the background would help engage in those conversations or not?
I can answer that question. So for my school, I'm in a vocational school and my vocation is design and visual. So we're all about the placements of art and doing the art. It's usually based on the teacher and they usually, when you want to like display art, so for example, we just did portraits of ourselves and we had to display that in different color schemes, like who's more have like darker hair and how it in the light affects like how you place the paper and how do you make sure everyone can see every detail that we did, because we had to do very specific details on our face, like mini like designs and have little cartoons of ourselves in our faces. So it all depends on how we would walk in and like go from left to right or right to left, or if you just go straight in the middle and just look around. So it depends on what artwork has this type of value of scale and like what is more darker, what is more lighter, and what affects that we can open the window to see the sun so everyone can see every part of it and make sure that the space around it has, you know, part of an art and you don't realize it until afterwards. So it all depends on like what picture or artwork that is seen and what color schemes that they have and what value do they have.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I want to go to your school. there's a question in the chat, but we're gonna answer it in a little bit because I think it is really relates to a couple of the other works. So I'm gonna move on to the next collection. Let's see. So this is a shelter in place gallery. It's a little hard to see because it's in this plastic or glass box and there's a lot of lighting behind it, or like the reflection in the lighting. And there's a screen here that shows kind of the images from the gallery, the interior gallery space that was shown on Instagram. So I'm gonna give a little bit of context. And so there's a bunch of pictures in here, but I'm going to give a little context and go back and forth. So the Eben Haynes is the designer, maker, artist, graphic designer at the MFA, also an amazing artist on his own and has work at the ICA right now. Y'all should check it out. And so my understanding is Eben created Shelter in Place Gallery. And let me see if I can get a close up. Look, there's Eben. There's the gallery that he created. And so he had this space in his apartment and my understanding is he would make miniatures or kind of use it as like a way to sketch out and think through ideas of larger pieces. So he already had this thing, pandemic hit, and people weren't making large scale works as much anymore. They weren't able to show in the same way that they have in the past because of all the restrictions. And so life as an artist totally changed overnight. Gigs were not happening the same way. So resources are scarce. And a lot of folks weren't able to go into their studio spaces to make work. So Eben and his partner, and I want to make sure I say the partner's name correctly, which I'm going to do in a second. Is it Delaney? Yeah, Delaney. They decided to turn this gallery into like an Instagram gallery. So shows could be curated. You could submit on the Shelter in Place website a proposal for an exhibition, solo exhibition, group exhibitions, and then they would do exhibits of art, like exhibitions of art over, like, maybe at once a week or once a month. I'm not sure the actual timing of it. And so I was introduced to this project because Michelle, who spoke earlier, reached out and said, would you want to participate in the craft show? I'm curating for the craft show exhibit. And so it was a collection of a lot of artists and created work for miniature. So 12 inches in real life is 1 inch in this gallery. And you make miniatures of your pieces. And it could be a new piece that you created for this particular exhibit, or it could be just a miniature of something that already existed. And then you create it, you drop it off, mail it, whatever, to Eben in little tiny packaging. And then he opens it and installs the work and then does a photo shoot and shows that on Instagram. I think it's really important to know that kind of context of that. I'm going to take a moment and stop sharing. And then I'm going to share the actual, for the craft show. I mean, there's a bunch of different images. This is just the one of mine. I made this little blue pod. So it's here. And these are the photos. Like, I had never seen that gallery before, like the actual structure. I had only interacted with it on my phone, seen what looks to be an actual gallery with artwork in it. And so I can flip through here. I started it out of order, but that's all right. And so this is the pod that I made with blue on the interior, and it has a little top to it. It's hiding back there. And this is the top that's on it here. And this is a miniature of a pod that exists in real life. And the pod kind of rocks on the base. And so it has a little kind of nub on the bottom. And I made it, the material is cedar, and I made it from the interior of that actual pod. So these are made out of, like, cut out of cedar blocks of wood. And I can make a pod from the exterior pieces, and then another pod from the inside, and another pod from the inside of that. And then I made a very tiny one because I happened to have the material left over. And so I made it for this exhibit. And so you can see, and it's painted with milk paint on the interior. So I think it's important to show this because this is, to me, Shelter in Place Gallery is this experience and not what's actually in the MFA. And so like the conversation for this is really different to me. Anyway, so I'm going to stop sharing that. I'm going to go back to our actual gallery. Let me see. Hang on one second, y'all. I have too many things open. Oh, sorry. There we go. The computer tricked me and hid my screen. So this was Evan and I in a conversation about the work. Can y'all see that? Okay. And then this is the shelter in place that's in at the MFA on exhibit behind a glass wall. And then, and this is on the right, you'll see a photo of the pairings. And so the pairing is my shelter in place gallery with the pod inside. And then it's paired with these little ceramic vessels by August Delahirsch. And there's a collection of these things. And there's more photos of the gallery itself. This is the interior view. So I zoomed in for this photo, which I just think is interesting because shelter in place gallery, the only experience that most people have is through their phone, seeing the interior space. And so this was the closest I could get as it's shown at the MFA. And then these are just photos of all the little vessels, which are super cute in their packaging. And so I just want to pose this question to the group, folks from the Teen Arts Council, but also specifically for the STEAM group, to think about these pieces. Like I have so many questions. I feel like I never had thought about before being an artist and actually having to deal with works in museum spaces and making sure that they last a long time and they look good. I had never thought about the conservation of the artwork. Like how do you do the pedestals and like the lighting and why, if you walk in there, it's really dim. There's not a lot of light and you can't see the interior very well. But there's reasons for all of that. Or like a big question is, where's the top of my pod? I showed up and I was like, where's the top of my pod? And Evan was like, it didn't make the cut. And so I just want to turn to the STEAM folks in the room and I think it's Ariana and forgive me, you'll have to say
Heather.
Ariana and Heather, right? And just like, let's talk about this because I'm super happy that the work is there. I think it looks good in the pairing, but it's also, to me, like missing a lot of things. So I just want to hear your thoughts on that.
Oh wait, we're on mute. No,
you're not on mute.
Yeah, we're good. We can speak now.
Okay.
Which question do you want us to answer first? The reason why your top is missing or the condition?
Anyone that you want.
I kind of want to talk about, it's kind of quick, but the light.
Yeah.
So sometimes light can damage some artworks. So even though it can present some things and like present things more, it can damage the artwork and sometimes it might not go with the actual exhibit. So let's just say this is a pretty dark room and we had like a big bright light shining on it so you can see everything. It kind of would make that stand out. It really just depends on what you want to stand out and what you don't want to stand out.
Mm-hmm. So I'm gonna go back and forth on this a little bit because I think it's fair to say, yes, the lighting can damage the work and you needed to do it carefully so that you're like preserving the work, but also highlighting what you want is what I hear you saying. And then I think about like, well, how long are these works meant to last? Right? Like, how long are they meant to last in a museum? Forever? Like, is that the goal? Is that possible? And I guess we're doing all that we can to preserve it. But then what's the intention for the artist? Like, it was the first time I had really thought about that in this way. You know, like, what are artists making work to last forever?
Obviously, like not everything can last forever, and that's why in the museum, like all the artworks, they're put on a rotation. So they're put up for a certain amount of time, and then they're taken down so they could get repaired, and they get like put in the dark.
Yeah.
Not like put in the dark, but put in like a safe area where it wouldn't go bad or whatever you want to call it.
Like when we went into that room where they had all the stored paintings and stuff, and it was like freezing in there.
Yeah,
because
they didn't want the paintings to go bad.
Right, and like so in some rooms you might feel really hot because everything in there is, and it's there for a reason. So the temperature is at a certain temperature because of the paintings and how things are going to go. But basically, the museum tries to keep everything going as long as possible.
Yeah. Wow. It's so interesting. I feel like they need to teach this side by side. You teach like, how do you paint? And then how do you think about
how to
preserving it, or, you know, the conservation of the work that's once it's created.
Sorry, on your question of, is art supposed to last, right? And are artists creating for their pieces to last? I'd like to ask you, are you creating for your piece to last? Do you want your piece to last? Are you hoping that generations from now, people are looking at it and thinking, wow? Because for some artists, and depending, like say I'm like a painter who does portraits from the 1700s, I'm creating for a wealthy family who wants their painting to last. But maybe I'm just making a basket from like BC 100, like then I'm not. I'm just making a basket because I need to collect berries. It depends on kind of who the artist is, where are we coming from, and what are we creating our art for?
And then what happens when it gets put in a museum and it wasn't like a person making a basket that just, you know, was not intended to be gifted generation after generation, right? And it ends up in a museum. The idea is that it's there forever as long as the museum exists. So yeah, I mean, those are good questions. I haven't thought about it in that way. I will tell you that I make mostly wooden sculptures, and I make them so that you want to touch them, which is absolutely against everything about museums. But right now, my work is now in the MFA, 2 of them, like the vessel that's upstairs in the exhibit upstairs. It's like a probably, I don't know, 20 inches tall or something like that. Like my son used to stand in that when he was a toddler. And when I've shown them at open studios or craft shows, people want to touch them. They look like very silky smooth. And if their hands are clean, I tell them they should touch them, because that's part of, like, when I make it, I'm touching it, and that's part of the process of making to me. And so I haven't been faced with that question in the same way, because only recently have my works ended up in museums, and I'm like, oh shoot, like that's a whole different, like there's 2 years of hand oils on those paintings or those sculptures that get put to there. So it's something that I'm thinking about a lot of more and more, because I do want my work to be purchased because I need to survive as an artist, but I also want my work is intended to be experienced, and part of that experience is a tactile one. So how do I balance those things out? Which is why it's interesting to talk to you all about this piece, which I feel like it's under like lock and key in a like fortress. And so where's the top? Anybody know?
The top will be in storage, Allison. the top is there. It has to be very, very carefully put aside. We have a system called the museum database. And so every single object that we have in the museum is logged in this database. And every time either a component, a piece, so your top would be called a component, or an artwork is moved, a registrar will go into the database, sometimes a curator too, and will say, now it's in storage box Z, or now it's in gallery number 168. And so it's continuously tracked. So you can see with every object in the museum, a history of where it's been across the museum for the whole of its life there, because it's so important to make sure that things don't leave, move, go in places, get lost, things that we don't know, go to places that we don't know. But your question about whether things should be kept in perpetuity is one I wrestle with a lot, especially for living artists like yourself. When artists are not with us anymore, you can interpret what they've written, or you can interpret their life, their biography, their practice, and kind of think, well, maybe they would have wanted X, or maybe they would have meant X, or maybe they left really explicit instructions sometimes. But when a living artist is there, it's a really difficult conundrum. It's what I'm thinking about just now, actually, in relationship to another work where an artist might say, I would like this work to be on display for a really long time in this space because I just want people to see it. And the message that I have in that work is important. And I don't care if it deteriorates a little bit faster than we thought it would. I need people to know this now because this issue is urgent, it's timely, and this is why I made the work. But the conservators and the curators might say, well, if we do it like this now, we're then going to have to put it to bed for 10, 20 years. And so in our thinking around it, we think, well, maybe then future audiences wouldn't be able to get to see it. So there's this constant wrestling with making sure that you honor the wishes of a living artist, especially, but then also think about what you are committed to in terms of future audiences too. It's a great question. I don't have any answer, but I love that you all asked it because it's an eternal wrestle at the museum.
Thank you, Michelle. And so Heather and Ariana, just thinking about the top, I know Michelle explained where it is, somewhere in that museum. Why, from your perspective, knowing about how these things are conserved, why couldn't it be displayed next to it? Do you know? Or do you think you know?
What we were told was that given that the top, the wood was unsealed, you can't really put it with any foams or styrofoams or silicones, I believe, because it would mess it up or whatever. And there was no little small, they couldn't make a small wire stand for it to stand on because that's extremely small, and I don't think our hands could do something like that. So that's just what we were told why your top isn't there. So I don't know how, but yeah. I would love for your top to be up there too, but
I mean, it's all right. I'm okay with it in the end of the day. I just was surprised. I was like, where did it go? But Evan and I had a back and forth conversation, and I think it's interesting because both he and I have full-time jobs as well as being an artist, and that influences our work. And so he's like, I pushed for this, I pushed for that. But he also has that perspective, the behind the scenes, like how things work. And it made me think educators, this is a really good opportunity for educators to engage students who are not as interested in making paintings, right, or making drawings, but to think about how, what's the science behind, having these things last a while, or how do we make sure that they are enjoy the way that the artist intended. And so what's the work that happens behind that and the thinking that happens. So I really appreciate you all's perspective, and Michelle chiming in about making sure it's not sitting on someone's desk somewhere. Any other thoughts or feedback? I'm recognizing the time, but any other thoughts and feedback about the Shelter in Place gallery, about the conservation of the pieces, from anybody, any of the Teen Arts Council folks? I know, Marta, we haven't heard from you in a while.
I really do think that this piece of artwork that you and what's the gentleman's name is, it's really beautiful. I think with the whole exhibit being so dark and really exposed to different types of arts and vibrancy and sort of different genres of art, I feel like the main focus of this and sort of like the little tiny individual like potteries, I feel like that in itself talks about individuality of how everyone is in this world, actually, how we're so closed in, and like you create your own art. And I feel like that's something you're very proud of. And I don't know, I feel like in this sense, those pieces of art mean something to you. And I feel like that in like being displayed on this museum, it really means something to like all of us, that, you know, you being a person of color that really represents pottery in a small dynamic, you know, exhibit in like a, you know, a really high museum. I feel like this is a really important moment in history, and I really love your art as well. So just seeing this, you know, all come together is just amazing. So yeah.
So that's really, I really appreciate you saying that, Marta, and recognizing that. So I have 2 little kids, and this piece was the first. I made a piece after I had my son, my first child, and then this was the first piece that I made after having my daughter. And it was during the pandemic where, you know, it was a rough time. I mean, it still is a rough time. But really, you know, speaking to the racial awakening or reckoning that's happening across our country, and the really public, you know, documentation and viewing and discussion and protest around the murder of many folks, specifically many Black folks. That was really, has always hit communities of color hard, and Black communities. But in that particular moment, I just, as a Black mom, I was really grieving with a lot of my peers, my Black mom friends. And so it was a lot of conversation. And so I felt like the invitation came. And so I was like, yes, I'll participate in this. I'll make something, even if it meant I'm like sanding something super tiny for hours after my kids go to bed, because it was a way for me to connect back to making, which it's a priority for me. But in a time when I needed to make with my hands, I needed to be productive at every moment, because otherwise it was a little, you know, you could easily be in despair, just recognizing kind of what was happening around all of us. And so thank you for saying that, because I hope many folks who look like me see our artwork, and they don't see, like, there's not a photo of me, but hopefully, you know, people will recognize that a lot of the artwork, especially in this exhibit, are made by folks of color. And it's like pretty cool to see that, because I had never thought of that being the case in the museums that I visited. So on that note, I'm going to go to the next, I'm going to kind of skip through and go to the next collection. These are all little ceramic pieces. And so this work, this will be the last one. We have about 15 minutes until the end. And so I'm going to, I know there's, in this conversation, there's a few folks in the audience. I'm going to kind of open this up to anybody, the teens that are in the room, the educators in the room, the MFA folks, because I think this piece is really amazing, especially this collection of pieces, especially being in Boston. So let me make sure I got my notes correct. So the work here, the pairing here, the work on the right is by Stephen Hamilton. Actually, do any of the teen folks know like the details of the works, or do y'all want me to say them all? I'm like wondering if there's like, because y'all are in the like, I guess we have the Teen Arts Council, not the curatorial team. But if you know the details and want to share or correct me, please do. But Stephen Hamilton, I met him when I was at the museum talking about this work. It was really amazing to hear. And I know someone in the chat asked about if artists have influence over the pieces, like giving feedback on what the pairings should be. And Michelle, you should correct me if I'm wrong, and maybe you know this, but from what Stephen said is that he did give feedback on the pairings for these pieces. And the pairing is the quilt stripes. And then the other one is the woman's Alojo cloth wrapper.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, the arts, not all of the artists are based in Boston. And I'm so sorry that I have my cat right here. We've just come back from a vacation. He's very, very excited to be very close to me. So if I put myself on mute, it's because you don't need to hear him yelling. But actually, you know, Eben lives in Boston, you live in Boston, and Stephen's also an artist who lives in Boston. And Stephen knows the collection of textiles really intimately, actually, as part of his research, much like you have a really multifaceted practice. You're an arts administrator, you're an educator, you're an activist, and you are also an artist, and those things mutually inform one another. Stephen's also a researcher. He's actually just begun a doctoral program at Harvard looking at history and thinking about the passage of knowledge, information, transfer between West Africa and other places around the world in terms of how textiles like the one on the very left in this image were made. And so, yes, he, you know, where we could, we invited the artists to respond to the pairings that we've created. We didn't want to put anyone living's work with an artist or another work where they didn't feel like it was complementary, or they just really didn't feel like there was a connection there. But Stephen actually came probably more than 15 years ago. There was another very large quilt show that featured the Gee's Bends artists at the MFA, and you know, almost 15 years ago, I think now. And he came to that show, and he remembers seeing those quilts up there, including a quilt like this in the middle. And actually, it's very deeply personal to him. His grandmother made quilts like this as well. And his grandmother had a fire in her house and lost many of these sort of family inheritances, the heirlooms that would have come down eventually to him. And so being able to have his work next to these works, and next to works that he deeply cared about and connected to his practice as a researcher, and then also his family history, were really important. So yes, not every artist participated as directly as Stephen, but he knew the collection so well. And he knew Jen Swope, our textile curator, so well, who's responsible for this part of it, that it made total sense to have this kind of depth of conversation with him.
Thank you for sharing that. I thought that was really interesting, and it made me, when he talked about it, you know, this workshop, if you want to call it that, this conversation tonight, you know, part of it is really saying, like, how do we bring these works to life for folks, for young folks, especially as they're walking through the museum or in their classroom. And hearing him speak about it made me feel a connection to the work and the pairing in a different way than if I just walked through. So I appreciate you kind of giving that insight. And his piece that's on the right, just to speak briefly about that, the image depicts a Boston high school student, Joseph Lewis, as the legendary first ruler of the Nri Igbo people, one of the most ancient groups of the Igbo people, one of Nigeria's 3 largest ethnic groups. And there's like a long description. We have the text of it, and please forgive me because I am kind of butchering the names, but just this idea of a Boston student. And, you know, I used to teach woodworking to middle school students, and that like kind of switch of us putting on, as young people, kind of putting on a new persona, a persona of people, and kind of an identity that exists, that is powerful and in charge, and knowing that we have, we are, you know, part of the African diaspora, and we're connected to that, right? So I just think that's an interesting, you know, complexity to the work and the layering that he does. So there's wooden panels on the sides. It's kind of hard to see. So I did a close up. And so this was his studio assistant, Jordan Nelson, who I believe worked on some of the textiles, the weaving that's done in here. And that's the artist, Stephen Hamilton. And so this is a little bit of a close-up of those pieces, but there's wooden panels on the 2 sides, and then these kind of woven tapestry with painting on it that has these portraits of students as these kind of legendary rulers. So I'm just going to open it up, you know, the little bit of time that we have left. And, you know, is there any comments or questions about these pieces that with our collective brain power, we're able to engage in?
I want to go back to something someone said, and please tell me who it was if you remember this being you, but I was so struck by what somebody said about the different types of works in this exhibition, that it's not all, painting, it's not all one type of work, it's really multidisciplinary. And in some ways, it's both the content of the work, so the meaning, the politics, the concept of the artists themselves that they've put into their work, but it's also the way in which they've created the works. Going back to Lavorne Jenkins, I think somebody was talking about the way in which that particular work, Elsa, maybe it was you, sort of comes off the wall and really creates this incredibly immersive space. And I wondered how that struck folks. I was really interested. I will hold my cards up and say, I'm a design and decorative arts curator. I actually have a t-shirt that says no flat art on it. And so I like material culture, and I feel very strongly about that being in every room in the museum if I had my way. But often we, segregate and move things we silo things into medium specific presentations. We see an exhibition of paintings, or we see an exhibition of sculptures. And here it's really across the board. And so I was really curious to ask the folks gathered how you found that. Did it feel too heterogeneous? Did it feel too discombobulating? Or was it fun, or was it interesting because you could choose what you gravitated towards and there was a mixture of different media? How did that land for people? Because we weren't sure that it would land well.
I think the opportunity to choose what you're looking at is really important. And the way that I think that this just jumps back to my point about accessibility from earlier, about how even if you have, because I think a lot of times museums, especially like highly curated exhibits, seem very like you have to kind of know what you're talking about to go into them. And I think that this exhibit does a really good job at dispelling that concept by saying like, look, you can look at any kind of art you want to look at. You can have sort of a conversation started for you, as opposed to you having to like do all of the intellectual labor yourself, but you can have the freedom to think about it however you like. And I think that point of accessibility is really important, especially when like bringing together all different types of art.
I love that term, Sadie, of accessibility, of being able to think about accessibility in multiple different ways. Very specifically not having to bring a ton of art historical knowledge. I can sit and lecture in front of a few of these works because they come from my expertise as an architecture and design historian, but for the most part, it's absolutely not my expertise areas. And so I really enjoy coming to them, as I might come to any other exhibition where I don't necessarily have some or even all of the knowledge behind it.
Yeah. I think it's the seeing all the variety of pieces of material. Actually, when people ask about my work in the museum and I tell them that it's upstairs, like the vessel, the walnut vessel is upstairs and it's kind of hard to find, but not really. And I give them this tour. But here I feel like the pairing of like, it's not just that this is the 3D space. This is not just the painting space. This is all the materials with a variety. Like it's about bringing those differences together. So it's about pairing different works that have things in common, but also have things that are different about them, pairing different mediums and kind of allowing the viewer, shall we say, or the participant, probably a better way to describe it, allowing them to make those connections and see the work equally. And so to me, that was kind of striking. Even though my piece is like this tiny, it feels like just as important as the paintings in the room, and that's like important. That's important as an artist, but also as a viewer. Does any of the teens have anything to add? We have to close in a few minutes, and I want to say a couple of things in closing. And I also will say one quick thing about Stephen Hamilton's work for folks that are in Boston. Not everybody is. If you go to look up his website. Sorry, my computer is not happy with me at the moment. But if you look up at his website, you'll see, here we go. Share screen, here we go. So you'll see an image, it's the Founders Project. That piece was made as part of this collection. And there's a lot, all the images are there of the separate pieces, but this was displayed in the Bowling Building where the BPS, Boston Public Schools central offices in 2018. And so it's just a very powerful image to see these paintings of students as, rulers, as kings and queens and whoever else lining this banister in the Bowling Building. And then, it shows all the individual images. So it's a really wonderful resource. In addition to the MFA site, it's a really wonderful resource to talk about that. And so does anyone else have anything to add about the any of the pieces, any of the pairings that we've seen so far? And I know there's many, many more. I don't want to take away the attention to all of the other works that are in there, but does anyone else have comments or questions about that?
Yeah, so I think I really like the mix of medium because it really ranges from like ceramics to stained glass to epoxy to it's just like all over the place, and there's not really like a set agenda that anything in that exhibit follows. So I really like how like mixed it is.
Thank you for that, Raheem. Anybody else?
I do want to add something actually, because it stood out to me a lot, but it was part of the artworks. It was a cross-pollination one, which was the red stained glass sort of flowers blooming and sort of pairings with I forgot what this name was, but it was like the genealogical floral fused. It was a photography taken by Japanese artist, and I feel like the disparity of culture in there as well is an artwork coming from Japan and an artwork being made by an American. I feel like in that sense it's bringing sort of a community together. It's having conversations between each other, having like similarities in between each other is like really educational in the sense for this workshop, because it really talks about the disparity of like how we can come together as humans and sort of speak on pieces of art and have conversations. So yeah, I feel like that's a really important pair I really liked. So yeah.
Marta, I want to share with you a piece of history that you might not know by looking at that work, but it's one of the works that I love too. So Judith Schachter, the glass artist, came to the MFA in Boston every month or so. She grew up just outside the city. And as a kid, this was the place where she'd say to her dad, take me here. This is where I want to go. I want to look at the artworks together. And so this collection was a large part of her becoming an artist. I think the mix of media is something that makes my heart, as I just said, very happy in this exhibition. But so often there hasn't really been a mix of different voices, as you've just pointed out. And glass is one of those mediums that until very recently was really dominated by men, and often by white men. A history that I can, if we had more time, talk about at further length. And so I'm so pleased to have this work by Judith in the museum. She's been an amazing teacher. She's taught many generations of students in Philadelphia, where she's been a professor for a long time. But she belongs in many ways to this museum because it's where she grew up. And she's one of these artists that we're really lucky to have in the collection. We just got that work in the collection because she's a female voice in what is a very male-dominated area of practice in glass. And so that's a little bit of the backstory there. I love that pairing very much. I'm glad you raised it.
I don't have an image of the pairing, but there's Judith in her stained glass piece.
I can't quite see that.
Oh, is it not sharing?
It's sharing another thing. I can.
Whoops. Sorry, y'all. Can you see that now? All right. I think my computer is kaput. It's decided it doesn't want to do what I wanted to do. So sorry about that. So just in closing, because I know it's almost 6 o'clock, I do want to, there's a whole list of thank yous that we're supposed to do. Before any of that, though, I do want to say a thank you to all of the teens that attended, that engaged in a conversation with me probably a month ago, and all the MFA staff that supported this conversation, and just thinking about how do we think about these exhibits a little differently and engage our educators a little differently, and really want to encourage, and I hope that this conversation did this, but encouraging folks to think about the context of the artwork and making sure that we're engaging our young folks or our students, that sometimes they're older than we are, but engaging them in the context of the work's been created, in the actual living context that we're in now, the work itself, and creating access points, entry points into that learning and that engagement, and recognizing that not everybody sees a piece of artwork and it's like, yeah, let me get more of that. Like, some people need a little help with engaging, and it's sometimes through the making of the pedestal or thinking about the lighting rather than the painting or the technique of some particular medium. So just for those educators, like, really encouraging folks to use this exhibit and the online resources to hopefully make art a little bit more alive and fun for our students. Emily, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, I am just so grateful to be hearing from you, Allison, from all of you who are part of the Teen Arts Council, who are part of STEAM, and Michelle, thank you so much. And I'll just say that the questions in the chat coming from the other teens really, I think, can just mirror the questions that as educators we're thinking about. Well, how do we talk to our students? How do we engage our students in thinking about this? And how are we as museum visitors thinking about an exhibition? I think, scrolling through that and seeing that will be a really meaningful way to try to sort of navigate how do we enter into these conversations when we leave this room. There's so much sort of generative discussion happening here, and then how does it transfer back into the classroom? And the hope is that an exhibition like this can provide that spark for when you are an educator by yourself, or maybe working with a few colleagues, sort of brainstorming, that you sort of bring that spirit of juxtaposition, of pairing, of creating entry points, as Allison said, for that student who isn't the most engaged, but that student who needs that extra push maybe, or that extra avenue. So I'm just so grateful for that, and also for how we have talked about the importance of representation in the gallery, in the classroom, and that is for the artist, that's for the people working on the exhibition, for speaking about the exhibition, and how that can also really impact how students are engaging with their learning and with the artwork. In addition to thanking all of you here, I want to thank Sophia Walter, who is the behind the scenes person making so much happen, and my partner in so many things at this museum. And I want to thank also the people who are supporting us financially. The expanded teacher and student resources that we have at the museum are supported by the Arabella Insurance Foundation, and teacher professional development programs are presented with support from the Rob Goldberg Connors Fund for Teacher Resources and the Louise O. and Robert F. Levin Fund for Innovation in Teaching. And that includes supporting these workshops, and then also supporting a new initiative we have called Art Finders, which we'll also put into the chat, where we are trying to do some of this actually in creating slide decks for teachers who write to us and say, oh, I'm working on this in my classroom. Like, what artwork do you have at the MFA that I can share with my students? And we try to think about what can we put together and pair up to invite that kind of spark of discussion in your classroom. So thank you so much to all of you. And we also just put in the chat, we do have 2 more workshops coming up this month, and then some other workshops later this winter. Next week's workshop is sold out, but the week after we have an incredible opportunity to hear from the artist Aqua Holmes, whose exhibition is on view right now, Paper Stories, Layered Dreams. And those walls are a purplish blue. And I invite you to see those in person or to hear her speak about that. There'll be a video of a recent public program about that exhibition online, and this one as well will be online a little bit later in the year, and we invite you to share it with your colleagues. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good night, y'all.